Thank you very much for coming, and I apologize for dragging you away from the NCAA. I don't apologize for dragging you away from it. Can you hear me? Am I good? Okay, right on. Okay, recording you go that way. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. What I want to talk about tonight is basically derived from some work that I've been doing over the last bunch of years with a friend of mine named Joel Wainwright, who teaches at Ohio State. So he can't take any responsibility for this. If this goes totally sideways, it has nothing to do with Joel. But the ideas on which I base this are based to a significant extent on conversations that he and I have had over the years. And it begins with a conversation that we've been trying to have over amongst ourselves, between the two of us, over a while for something that we have called climate leviathan. And it's the idea of climate leviathan, because most of you won't know what that is, because most of you won't have read the academic paper on which it's based, it's basically a concern with climate change that most of us all have, and a kind of anxiety that arises from that, especially in the capitalist global north, perhaps, even though, of course, the impacts are going to be greater in other parts of the world. But for Joel and I, one of the biggest concerns about climate change, and probably for you too, is the fact that the perils that it poses for us are not just purely sort of environmental in the sense of water scarcity and these kinds of things. In many ways, potentially the bigger crisis of climate change is the politics that might emerge from it. And we are particularly fascinated by what we see as a kind of dominant theme in progressive circles in much of the sort of global north around a desire for a kind of world government that will tell us all what to do. It will tell us how much we can emit, it will tell us how the problem can be fixed, and it will provide a technical solution for what is essentially a global problem. And it will be framed as such and technicized at that level. Now, the democratic concerns that arise from the emergence of such a thing are, of course, significant. But nonetheless, for example, around the organization around that preceded Copenhagen several years ago, you'll see an almost collective, desperate wish on the part of a whole bunch of white progressives like me that they'll come to an agreement and tell me how much I can emit, and it'll all be okay. And we're concerned about that direction. So I wanted to start here just with a couple of slides. And these are just to kind of frame things. Almost everyone in the room, of course, will be more than familiar with the data that this is communicating. Hopefully the coolness of the maps will overcome the fact that you already know this. I stole these from a really cool mapping project online called KILN, K-I-L-N. I don't know what it stands for, but it's really awesome. So this is national CO2 emissions per capita in 2013. Just came out in terms of the map. And you can see that, of course, the darker is the higher emissions per capita. We, come close to the United States and some other countries in terms of that. But you can see it's a pattern that you might expect. Can you hit the next slide there? So this is the same map distorted to demonstrate the intensity of those per capita emissions. So you can see that the U.S. we look pretty good here. I don't really know how that's the case. Maybe it's just because there's so few of us, given the space that we have. But you can see that China and the U.S. dominate this kind of thing. They balloon when the map is distorted to demonstrate per capita emissions. And then can we go to the next one here? This is the one that we're most interested in. So this is the same map, per capita emissions, but the map is distorted by the percentage of the population that is exposed to significant risk, like life-threatening risk, given the implications of climate change. And you can see that North America shrinks to a tiny little spot on the map. And the poorer part of the world balloons, which is only a way of communicating what you all already know, which is that climate change is not only, of course, coming our way hard, but it's going to hit the poorest and most marginalized and in many ways least robust, technically, communities that we have. And so these people are most at risk. Now what Joel and I, and this is what I'm going to focus on tonight, is that we feel like we can say with reasonable certainty that this is a recipe for upheaval, for social upheaval, for unrest, for revolution. This map is sort of evidence of that. And so we think about climate leviathan that might, say, emerge from Paris or slowly accumulate from meetings like Paris in December.
as the emergence of a sort of global regulatory regime, not sort of, a global regulatory regime, or authority that commands the planetary relationship with carbon. It is a sovereign in the sense, in the carbon realm, in the sense of all sovereigns, or the ones that we normally theorize in the Western mode. It decides the exception, it determines the rules, and it also determines the moments at which those rules can be broken and how. Can we go to the next? So just to show you that I'm not like conspiracizing here, I just wanted, so this quote is my only text-based slide. I super apologize, text-based slides suck, but I'm going to read it to you anyway and you'll get the feel for it. So this is from, some of you have seen me show this slide before, I think, but this is from John, a book written by the Ehrlichs, the notorious sociobiologist crazies from Stanford, and John Holdren, who is the chief scientific advisor to Obama right now. This is written in the 70s. It says, toward a planetary regime, perhaps those agencies, meaning the ones that he's just described, combined with UNEP and the United Nations population agencies, might eventually develop into a planetary regime, capital P, capital R. Sort of an international super agency for population, resources, and environment. Such a comprehensive planetary regime could control the development, administration, conservation, and distribution of all natural resources. Thus, the regime could have the power to control pollution, not only in the atmosphere and oceans, but also in such freshwater bodies, blah, 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 blah. The regime might also be a logical central agency for regulating all international trade, perhaps including assistance from developed countries to lesser developed countries, and including all food on the international market. The planetary regime, always with a capital, might be given responsibility for determining the optimum population within regional limits. Control of population size might remain the responsibility of each government, but the regime would have have some power to enforce the agreed upon limits. This is a proto-Copenhagen, gone ballistic, of course. But these are the kinds of modes of thought that we're concerned about. This is a particularly nasty example, but I like it anyway. Now, one of the other things about Copenhagen and about meetings in Paris is that they are, to a significant extent, still focused on mitigation. Carbon mitigation, who can emit, who cannot, how do we reduce emissions? But of course, as even the International Energy Agency has recently admitted, we are past the point at which mitigation is our only solution. There is no meaningful way in which we will avoid significant, potentially catastrophic implications of climate change. We are already past the point of no return. Now, if that's the case, then adaptation, as we might think of it, is clearly on the table much more significantly than it has been in the past, when we thought maybe we could somehow curtail things and stay at our sort of nice plateaued 2 degree limit, if you want to call it that. Now, much of this, of course, gets at the question of technique. It presents the problem as a technical problem, one for which proper administrative and scientific knowledges might provide a solution. And this arises at the same moment that, at least in my tiny world of human geography, there's also a great deal of discussion of something so-called a post-political moment, a moment at which we are post-politics. And the world is becoming less an agonistic realm and more one in which the technicization and proceduralization of liberalism come to dominate. Now, I'm guessing that many people in the room will agree with me that the post-political frame is an inadequate description of our current world. But whether or not one takes the proposition seriously, there's no shortage of debate on which to fertilize this kind of discussion. And virtually every prominent radical philosopher, and I put radical in quotes because I don't really know what the word means these days, has much to say about the political. And many tell the story of its demise, the onset of this post-political. So despite their somewhat enthusiastic plays at disagreement, I would say, the ruling radical intelligentsia, in which I include Badiou, Zizek, Rancière, the whole gang, we witness everywhere what Zizek calls, he says, a new bipolarity between politics and post-politics. Now, like Chantal Mouffe, Alain Badiou, Rancière, hatred of democracy, these kinds of things, Zizek demands we endorse what he calls, as I said earlier, an agonism that revels in opposition and struggle for their own sake. And this is a quote from Zizek himself. To engage in struggle means to endorse Badiou's formula, mieux vaut un désastre qu'un désêtre, which is basically like a snooty way of saying it's better to have a disaster than to not really be. For my purposes, The political refers neither to the existential fact of struggle, this agonism that is thrown around so much, nor, not that it's not worth something, nor to a particular political condition or set of institutions like liberal democracy or parliamentary system, but to what I want to try and describe as the very grounds on which such conditions, institutions, or struggles arise and are formulated. So what is the realm of the political? What counts as the political in which we can have this agonistic relationship or have a post-political moment? Now, it's not merely the realm of the clash of interests or of agonistic confrontation, or collective or individual self-actualization. Rather, it defines, I think, and I'm following Nikos Poulantzas here, as a thinker who I really, really admire a lot, but I also find very tough to read, so those of you who haven't read him, I can totally sympathize. At any rate, for Poulantzas, the political defines the realm in which the relationship between the governed and the governors is figured out, between the dominated and the dominant. That is what defines the political as a realm. Now, if these are the grounds on which this stuff gets figured out, then this is a very appropriate term, because implicit in any mode of this political is a spatio-temporal context, of course, in which it unfolds and which it helps shape, of course. Any politics assumes and asserts an historical and geographical terrain on which it lays claim. And of course, I always put the geographical thing in there because all geographers always mention geography whenever they have a chance to do that. And I'm going to avoid saying space, but when I say geography, I mean space. There is truth to the accusation that geographers like kind of add space and mix. There's a lot of that. So I'm going to try and avoid it, but it's tempting at times. Anyway, the specifically political character of the capitalist nation state, I would argue, is constituted in the separation, at least formally, of the state and civil society. The state as its own realm, and civil society as the non-state realm. These are the grounds upon which the legitimacy, one might argue, of the liberal capitalist state rests. And its hegemony in our contemporary political imagination underwrites our assertion, Joel's and mine, that if climate leviathan is to emerge, it will do so as an elaboration of existing forms of sovereignty. We're not talking about a brand new way of doing things here. We're talking about an elaboration of what exists, enabling, for the most part, the world's most powerful states to engage in planetary management. So the emergence of the capital P, capital R planetary regime is not like Malawi and Chad running the show. This is the people who are already in charge taking a planetary role that they already arguably have done in many, many other realms. Now, if this is true, a crucial and difficult question of our hypothesized climate leviathan, that climate leviathan must answer the question, how do we get from our sort of Westphalian, rather contained world, where every nation supposedly has its autonomous zones of power and authority, how do we get from that to climate leviathan in a way that preserves the nation state? Because clearly the most powerful nation states in the world right now have no interest in the diminishment of something like national sovereignty as it's currently understood. Now, the current mode of global political economic regulation, I would argue, is constituted to a significant extent by liberal capitalism, UN conventions, Bretton Woods, these kinds of things, free trade agreements, the EU. And in this realm, even when it is recognized as a problem, this matrix denies the political significance of climate change, I would argue. It is framed as a technical policy problem, best addressed by fuel-efficient cars and tradable permits. Which is to say that while planetary warming accelerates ecological transformation and human suffering quite rapidly, for capitalist states, it nonetheless does not yet signify or presage a fundamental transformation in the political realm. In the wealthy world, climate change still does not matter, or alternatively, its mattering is refused. I don't know if mattering is a word, but it sounded really good there. Instead, the buildup of anthropogenic greenhouse gases is confronted as mere market failure for which the standard solutions are posed. Cap and trades, offsets, financial innovation, catastrophe bonds, which is a financial instrument that some of you may be familiar with. In the lingo, they call them cat bonds. It's basically betting that things are going to go really horrible, and you'll win if they do. Mandatory risk disclosure and insurance, all of these instruments are the means by which we might address the problem. Now, this denial explains the debacle, I would argue, that represents the most obvious incubator of climate leviathan, which is the formal UNFCCC processes that we see unfolding in Copenhagen and Paris and all the rest of them. Now, these things are stunted both by affluent nation sabotage, an attempt to actually derail these conversations, but also by developing world resistance. Now, and the developing world resistance is, of course, probably very justifiable. Nonetheless, it shares with the former, affluent nation sabotage, shares with the former a futility rooted in a fidelity to the conventional economic thinking by which the nation-state-centered liberal capitalist matrix operates, since it relies just as heavily as the dominant narrative does, on an essentially technical distribution of costs and benefits. So what ends up happening, of course, is the UNFCCC table, the opposition of the developing world is fundamentally about the proper disposition of the various rewards and penalties that come with inevitable climate change, as opposed to fundamentally challenging the politics of those agreements themselves, which is happening, but more in climate justice movements on the ground. In other words, both developing nations and the affluent people who are trying to slow things down are trying to solve what is effectively an optimization problem in the standard neoclassical matrix, whose terms must include coefficients for colonialism, underdevelopment, massive historical displacement, and impoverishment. And this is to say nothing of inequalities internal to the less developed countries. In other words, climate change cannot be addressed by this kind of economic reason, which, because it denies itself a conscious politics, in fact, the whole frame is to denounce politics as a distortion of the market. Because it has no conscious politics, it cannot think about history and the irrepressible ways in which history must always matter. In other words, on orthodox economic terms, a global solution to climate change on this kind of dominant frame is not merely politically unlikely, it's actually logically impossible. There is no market-based solution to a massive problem whose causes took place before it was possible to price their repercussions. So, which means, for those of you in on the kind of econo talk, there is no Coasian solution, named after Harold Coase, the problem of social cost. There is no Coasian solution to climate change, no way for self-interested actors to address the problem of social cost, when the very ground on which the problem must be addressed, the political, is explicitly disavowed in the frame thinking. This is not to deny that there is not a meaning to, when these conversations happen, it's not to deny that there's no such thing as environmental debt. You know, the idea that we who have developed on the backs of the earth are now denying the possibility of wealth and security to those in poor parts of the world. It's not to deny that. It's impossible, in fact, to deny that the luxurious life of the capitalist part of the world is desertifying West Africa, inundating Pakistan, and trashing what is now called Northern Alberta. We cannot deny that. But it is also just as impossible to price those implications. Now, so which means that if, as we are often told, the market is by definition apolitical, then it is clearly ridiculous to suggest the market is a solution to what is today's defining political problem. Whose lives will pay the cost for adapting to a warmer planet? Somebody's will. We know that. That's a political problem. We are not getting out of this with everyone just doing okay. Now, this failure endlessly frustrates, I would argue, all market-based efforts to allocate a global pool of emittable greenhouse gases. And even the powers that be know this now. So if you can read Joseph Stiglitz, who's considered on the left in the world in which he operates, even he is willing to acknowledge the fact that we're beyond the point of no return. The constant intrusion of those pesky politics of the unpriceable history of the present, in other words, colonialism, displacement, underdevelopment, inequality, these simultaneously legitimate resistance and explain liberal capitalism's rather self-interested shirking of historical and moral accountability at the table. For the South and indigenous peoples all over the world, it justifies the rejection of petty payments that are supposed to let them forget the crimes of history. And for the North, for whom the ways and means of liberal capitalism and the nation state are held up as our only hope, for them the only way forward is the declaration of what is effectively an atmospheric blank slate, a total erasure of the record of past wealth-producing emissions, and the construction of an abstract climate equality from here on out in the face of a future that's quite daunting. This is when we hear things about the global village, we're all in this together, a lot of talk of the Anthropocene, we all did this, everybody created this problem, we're all in it together. This is where this comes from. And this political adaptation is no solution at all. Instead, it suppresses, as it must, the fact that adaptation to climate change will not be cheap and many will suffer, and are already suffering. To broach the question in this manner, I would say, is a manner that recognizes, to broach the question in a manner that recognizes this truth is categorically impossible in the liberal capitalist nation-state framework because the political qua category is deemed dangerous because it distorts market forces with irrational interests. The tendency toward climate leviathan is predicated on the assumption that the future requires the persistence, therefore, of existing forms of juridical subjectivity to produce, in what is in effect, a classical liberal world with which we can confront the climate problem. We all operate according to the proper incentives. We all respond to the proper insurance mechanisms and various securities. Then we will produce a world that is climate safe. This is the crucial adaptation of the political realm in the contemporary liberal capitalist global north. Climate change should be addressed by tweaking citizen subject status to include a role as emission source. So we think of ourselves as having a certain set of a bundle of rights, and with that come an obligation to understand ourselves as being individual emitters of carbon. This adaptation asserts itself as a project that necessarily depends upon the nation state or its subnational units, because every citizen, both local and global, is by definition the subject of a nation state at present. By accurately pricing each carbon agent's contribution, the goal is to create market spaces in which orthodox liberal reason and orthodox liberal concepts concerning freedom of markets, property rights, and all that stuff will actually work. So the dream really here is to create a regime in which the modes of interaction and exchange, the modes of production that dominate capitalism as we sort of conventionally understand it, is to create a world in which those rules actually are fine-tuned to such an extent that we can act in incentivized channels such as to produce a climate-safe world. The dream is a market world that will produce safety and security at the end. Now, with the growing awareness that the mitigation window, in other words, stop emitting and we'll be okay, with the growing awareness that that window is closed, this project is becoming tightly linked to plans to geoengineer our ways to safety via massive techno-social mitigation by planetary manipulation, which in my text I have hyphens between the words because I like the way that looks. Mitigation by planetary manipulation. Commonly cited examples include plans to increase atmospheric albedo, to alter ocean chemistry, to absorb more carbon. We might also include carbon capture and storage in this, because the idea of hiding gigatons of carbon underneath the Earth's surface will require something pretty much close to geoengineering. Now, of course, this alone won't bring climate leviathan into being, but large-scale projects will inevitably, one might expect, involve a relatively small group of actors, states, militaries, firms, multilateral institutions, academic institutions, experimenting effectively with global systems in what it is hard not to see as the most improbable of missions we could imagine, which is to materially reconfigure the whole fucking planet so we don't have to change capitalism. That's the bet on the table. It's almost impossible to imagine it working. At any rate, because any means of evaluating geoengineering projects like this, and this is already happening at the tables of power, will be intensely politicized, a legitimate and objective planetary authority to adjudicate the merits of certain experimentation. Do we dump, all those iron filings in the ocean in the hope that they'll bounce the sun rays back and all the rest of it? Who knows? Give it a try. Well, we'll ask the authority with the techno-scientific confidence that we will hope that they have. In other words, this has, in many ways, descended into a battle between a so-called capital R reason aligned with hegemony, current hegemony, or what is posed as a chaotic descent into a state of nature. Between them stands the promise of a Copenhagen-like planetary sovereign leviathan that declares the experimental exception in the interests of life itself, human life itself, for the whole of the world. Planetary sovereignty emerges in what might be called, a right to the world, in a sense. The arrogation of the authority and the duty to remake the world as it sees fit in order to save it. Now, at this point, I'm sort of heading on the downslope of the talk a little bit. But I want to return to the idea of the realm of the political specifically here, and to what and how we think about politics in an age of potentially catastrophic climate change. And I don't want to speak for anyone else in the room, but I have moments where things look really grim. You know what I mean? Where you're lying in bed and it's like, this is shitty. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all those deniers are right and it'll all be okay. But it doesn't feel like that most of the time. And so So there is a way in which the potentially, which I'll get to, but there's a way in which the potentially catastrophic nature of the future is in both understandable but also very troubling ways reshaping the present, as the future tends to almost bend backward into our lives and distort perhaps how we might approach the present precisely because of the future we're afraid of reaching. Now, in a preface to Capital, Marx wrote, my standboy, I don't know about that. You might have written that, I didn't write that. My standpoint from which the development of economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains. Socially speaking, however much he may subjectively raise him, we might say, or herself above them. Now, for the contemporary climate justice movement, I would argue, this is a far more radical lesson than it might at first appear. For it is to say that an adequate account of the current transformation, the onset of what is sometimes called, as I mentioned earlier, the Anthropocene, that an adequate account of the current transformation must reject what is effectively the dominant narrative of modern environmentalism, which is a subjective moralism. You don't recycle, you suck. You flew, you suck. You own a car, you suck. There's a moralism, and it's very individualized, that dominates contemporary environmental politics, I would argue. Now, if the development, as Marx said, of the economic formation of society is a process of natural history, in which the individual is not responsible for relations whose creatures he or she remains, then what is to be done, and on what political basis can it be legitimated, whatever it is? If we are moments in natural history, nodes inextricably enmeshed in a world that is organized by far more than human purpose, what does that mean for us? Indeed, one might say, to live and work in the world is to be a carbon being. Carbon is, after all, the second most abundant element in our bodies, and we metabolize it to power basically everything we do. The problem, of course, is thinking on this line is how to avoid taking this natural historical fact as an argument that for anything other than paralysis, overdetermination, exculpation, in other words, letting everyone off the hook, or helplessness, which is what I often feel, if I'm honest with you all. We are learning, if we didn't already know it, that to be is by definition to put carbon into the atmosphere. There is no way around it, no authentic carbon neutral humanity out there. Offsets will not save us. This is our natural history. The present chapter in this history is structured to a significant extent by capitalism as a social formation. I think hopefully we can agree on that. And at least for those with the largest carbon budgets, as they say, it is on the basis of our existential relation with carbon that the world is sort of currently constituted. What is to be governed in this sense by climate leviathan is the very stuff of which we are made. This helps explain, I think, why the global politics of climate change and the potential for a political adaptation, an adaptation of the grounds on which we approach the problem, is essentially at present being shaped by struggles over the relationship between what we might call like carbon subjectivity and carbon agency. In other words, the subjectivity that is imposed upon us by those social forces in the natural historical mode, but also the agency, our individual capacity or collective capacity to address ourselves and the world as carbon beings. For if to emit or not to emit, cheeseball, sorry, couldn't help it, is not a question, it's not a question, or at least, yeah, you weren't expecting that, were you? Or at least not one of mere subjective choice, then the hegemony of environmental individualism, as my friend Sean Blenkinsop calls it, in liberal climate politics, is leading us into a political cul-de-sac. Indeed, it seems, I think, that we are already there. The ongoing failure of current efforts, not to mention the end of any hope for meaningful mitigation, is not only evidence of the futility of such efforts, but one of the most powerful arguments, I think, behind the rise of something like what we might call climate leviathan. If people will not make the right choices on their own, then they must be made to do so. And the appeal of this, I think, is quite widespread, even for those of us who might be wary of its implications. The more complicated and politically more urgent question, perhaps also, is the emerging forms of carbon subjectivity these dynamics propose and produce, both in the heart of the carbon-spewing north and the more varied carbon geographies of the south and indigenous groups across the planet. It is perhaps here in the relationship between what we might call a biopolitical subjectivity in this natural historical sense and a transformational agency that we all hope we have, that we are bound to find our questions leading, the terrain on which the adaptation of the political itself, and I have no idea what that will look like, must inevitably unfold. Now, what I want to flag here, though, of course, is that despite the fact that this seems kind of epochal in the epochal sense, actually, is there another word that sounds like that? Maybe there's not. Maybe you all knew what I said. But anyway, that's what I meant, that word. And I won't spell any more of my talk. Is that this is a really old problem, this break between a sort of biopolitical, like a framed or socially produced subjectivity and an idea of some sort of agency inside us. It's a very old problem. Indeed, it might be the puzzle at the core of all revolutionary thought, the problem to which all action must offer some sort of response, however scientific or mystical. Now, the question of revolution thus always haunts the adaptation of the political. And that's the argument that we're trying to make. Can you go back to the slide just previous? Sorry. And that's the premise upon which or that's the lens through which we look at something like that. Because the adaptation of the political, at least in the contemporary frame, is an attempt to forestall revolution, to forestall significant social change. This specter of radical transformation is just one more fund upon which those in support of Leviathan can draw, because Leviathan can promise a stability that other forms of change cannot. Now, in a really wonderful book about the relationship between political philosophy and revolution in Europe, which sounds maybe really boring, but it's really not, Stathis Kouvalakis, who is not only an awesome philosopher, but also just became an MP for Syriza. He's super cool. And if any of you read this wicked interview he just gave with Jacobin, he's on the far left of the party. He's like the main spokesman for the far left of the party. He just gave an excellent kind of history of Syriza interview to Jacobin, for any of you who are interested. It's really, really good. It's really, really long. It's really good. Anyway, he wrote this wicked book. And in it, he said, he went back to Kant. He was really interested in Kant and Hegel and all the people you'd imagine. And he says that Kant finds alarming in the prospect of revolution, or finds the prospect of revolution alarming because of the moment of vacuum, he says, the vacuum that it creates, insofar as it implies the threat of regression to a state of nature. I actually think that's a very widespread fear. It's not something that's particularly Kantian. And the fact that Kant has mattered so much to liberal political thought, especially in the 20th century, like John Rawls, the whole bit, the kind of, the stabilizing philosophical narrative of American modernity is very Kantian in that sense. And I would say that this fear of revolution and the vacuum and the descent into something called the state of nature, this is an overwhelming kind of undercurrent, if there can be one, in modern political life. In this sense, I would say there are millions and millions of Kantians today. Just as an aside, one of the craziest things about the kind of history of Marxist thought, which I geek out on a little bit, is that to be a Kantian is like basically the worst thing you can be. And everyone would call each other it. There didn't seem to be any consistency at all. So in 1910, everyone's like, oh, he's a total Kantian. And everyone's like, oh, hate that guy. And then the other guy was like, oh, no, he's a Kantian. And it was like this brutal fight over who would be a Kantian and who wouldn't be. I've always thought it's very strange to define yourself by that, but perhaps I'm doing the same thing now. At any rate, there are millions of Kantians, office towers, bureaucracies, NGOs, community groups, the UN, and multilateral institutions, at least in the way I'm describing them. They are Kantians not simply in propounding an environmental individualism founded in a new categorical imperative, recycle, don't fly, don't drive, but just as much in the experience of a similar alarm in the face of potential social change. In this case, with respect, again, to climate change. Much of our current approach to climate change politics, at least in the dominant narrative, the one that drives Copenhagen and Paris, is driven by this fear of an ecological resource scarcity precipice we perceive to be on the horizon. And so one need only look at the drought in California to feel a little bit of this very closely, I would argue. 80% of the fresh fruits and vegetables in North America come from California, and they have no water. And what little they have is so deep in the ground, they've already pumped it all out. Anyway, I can just get myself into a panic just like I'm describing. Anyway, it seems clear that this fear is a significant part of the reason something like Climate Leviathan just like other leviathans, one might argue, can come to make so much sense to us. But a refusal of this position, however difficult and however intimidating, is essential. There is no state of nature, no true human sociality or bestiality, or lack thereof, to which we inevitably regress in the absence of something called civilization. First, because the concept of civilization, the very idea, the possibility of the idea of civilization, emerged with the birth of liberal modernity itself. So any concept of its lack, at least in the Hobbesian, oh my God, I gotta kill you to get that fish kind of sense, is just as modern as the idea of civilization itself. But second, history puts a lie to that state of nature stuff immediately, wherever we look. The critical assertion that there is no essentialist way we will all be or really are if somehow opened up to the state of nature is not merely like a political preference, like, oh, I really, that's not true, I really hope it's not true. It's just true. There is no way we all really are. There's no evidence of that. Which is to say that if what makes climate change terrifying is the expectation that people will revert, that's always the way in which it's framed, is that it's an historical retrograde something, backwardness, that we will revert to a war of all against all, in Hobbes' famous frame, that is the state of nature. If that's the fear, it is absolutely essential to recognize that that reversion would neither be a product of climate-induced scarcity, nor of nature, human or otherwise. The war of all against all might very well, one might argue, loom on some horizons, along with leviathans to go with it. But in all cases, they will be products of historical social relations and are only inevitable to the extent that the way we live now makes them so. If we are Hobbesian, it's because we have made ourselves so, and there is nothing inevitable or irrefutable about it. To grasp the adaptation of politics, we would need to read our strange present conditional politics, which is what I was referring to earlier, in which what might happen in the future seems so much to frame how we live now. We have to think about that as a conjuncture, in the Gramscian sense of the term, which means a present, thinking about the present and a history of the present that emphasizes its existence as a complex of pasts and futures meeting all in one place. It's going to change, but that's how it is right now. And what I want to suggest is that the political adaptation that we may anticipate with something like Climate Leviathan is defined by a politics organized to confront a future that, as I said earlier, bends back to shape the present. And the appeal of something like Climate Leviathan, the sovereign that will tell us what we can do, what will be safe, how to live, the appeal of that is secured by its claims to structure a present that will realize a certain future, one that's worth living, and the other ones are not. The result is a politics, I'm not the first one to say this, I'm like the 90 billion. The result is what seems like, and accurately described as, a politics of emergency, where politics is constantly deferred in terms of actual struggle in the interests of technical command. This deferral is premised upon a future that increasingly many of us await only with fear. Now, this peculiarity may explain why the era in which we live, which is so saturated in struggle, everywhere we look, people who are here in this room are only here probably because this is what they're interested in. A world in which we live is so saturated in struggle still gets called post-political. A world in which we seek institutional industrial technologies with which to avoid a future necessarily presupposed by the world in which, however reluctantly or unjustly, we all are condemned to live. This is where we live. If we want to struggle, this is the only place to do it. How this came to be post-political, I don't know. Which is to say, I guess, that what we are experiencing is less after politics, post-politics, than another politics. I don't know what that will be. It's still unfolding for sure, and it's not unfolding the same everywhere. This other would, of course, be the first victim of the state of emergency that Climate Leviathan is trying to correct. A state of emergency that's constructed for a disappearing world, one that will be inadequate to itself almost immediately upon the realization of what it expects to happen. I'll stop there. I had a bunch more of that. Thank you very much.